They had put her dismembered body into 3 separate holes that they had dug. And, that was that. That was the end of Vanessa. That was the end of the story. And that is what Cicely had admitted to. Electric chair. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Madison, and welcome to the Madison channel. Today we have a very intense story. This is another installment of True Crime in Society, where we discuss true crime stories that center BIPOC individuals. And today we are going to be discussing the very tragic case of Vanessa Guillén, the army woman who was found dismembered off of the base in Fort Hood. Now, this case happened in 2020, and it was huge on social media. It became a huge national news story by a lot of hard work from her family. But we're going to get into the details of the case. We're going to talk about all of the situations that happened with the case and hopefully honor her memory. Now, if that sounds exciting for you, if you like my channel, if you like the content here, please stick around, like this video, comment under this video, and subscribe to this video. Press that notification bell so you know every time I post a new video. I post videos every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So be there or be square. And if you're returning, hello, welcome. We have reached over 1,000 subscribers. I'm just trying to get my watch time up. So if you're new here, if you want to help a girl get her watch time up so she can get monetized by the end of this month, then hit that channel page and check out all the content that I have. I have several videos. I've been posting consistently since January, so there's a lot of content to go through. That being said, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you for coming back. Love you all. And let's get into this story. Now, I guess I just want to kind of start about my true personal feelings about the military-industrial complex and the military in this country. The first person and the only person in my day-to-day life that I interact with who was in the armed forces was my grandfather. He was a doctor in the Korean War in the late 60s, and he leveraged that experience to come back and become a well-renowned, well-respected ear, nose, and throat doctor in Southern California. But he was absolutely the only person that I interacted with daily that had some experience in the Army. And I'll tell you why that smells of the privilege I have in my family. Okay. War used to be thought of as a noble thing to be a part of. So think the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, think World War I and World War II. It was thought of as a duty, as a man in this country to fight for this country, to volunteer your life to this country. And the armed forces were able to get enough people to have full battalions and have a good population of people who are willing and ready to die for their country and fight for their country, for the rights of this country, period. And that sustained us for a very long time. Having, there's some drafting, of course, but having a good, robust amount of people who were passionate enough and wanted to dedicate their life to fighting for this country. That concept began to shift definitely post the Vietnam War, but during the Vietnam War, when the draft started to take center stage. Now, if you don't know what the draft was in the Vietnam War, every man in a particular age group was given numbers, and these draft numbers would be pulled, and if your draft number was pulled, you'd be forced to enlist into the Army. Now, there are different ways that wealthy people were able to get out of this. Donald Trump was someone who was able to get out of it, but if you're going to college, if you had connections and could get some sort of letter, then didn't have to go to the Army during the Vietnam War. And a lot of people exploited that loophole. But the reason why you don't hear a lot about the draft to this day after the Vietnam War was because that the unpopularness of the war. And if you want more information about the war and all of that, I have a video on Agent Orange on my channel, which I'll link in the description, where I do a brief kind of overview of the Vietnam War. It's one of my favorite historical pieces, time periods for me to like investigate. So I know a lot about it. But the Vietnam War was wholeheartedly, extremely unpopular. It was one of many satellite wars that were fought in the name of the Cold War. So really, a lot of these wars were fought in countries where brown people existed. But the true nature of those wars was we were fighting against the Soviet Union and trying to stop the spreading of communism. We're not going to get too deep into that, but the Vietnam War is and remains to be one of the most unpopular wars in American history. Why is that? Well, we came in to a war that was technically between the French and Vietnam, which was a French colony, and we lied to the American people for years about how serious our involvement in the war was. Once it was leaked by papers being leaked and whistleblowers being, sounding off about what was really going on in Vietnam, a lot of people began to change their opinion about the war and the reason why we're there. Mind you, a lot of black people, a lot of famous black people, one being Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali, was very vocal about why people of color should not be fighting in this war. But there was a huge public anti-war movement because the lying of the United States, the fact that we were bleeding money for this war that was unnecessary and people were dying, and a lot of trauma is around that war and around that time. And it has affected our politics from that point forward. That being said, the draft was one of those linchpin things that was so unpopular because what ended up happening was wealthy people and their kids were able to kind of scoot by being able to be enlisted and drafted into the war, while poorer people or people without many options or without many connections were forced to go to war. Now, after Vietnam, the draft kind of disintegrated. I'm sure they can reinstate it if we needed it to happen. But the draft kind of disintegrated because they basically pointed to it as being one of the most controversial things that made people not support the Vietnam War and caused all this disruption stateside around the Vietnam War. Now, because of that, conversations about war being talked openly, broadcasting war footage, the way that they broadcasted Vietnam, a lot of the higher ups in this country said that was the reason why it was so unpopular. So our conception of war changed. So they no longer had live broadcasts on, the front lines. They no longer showed pictures or anything on mainstream media about what was going on in the war, especially particularly graphic videos, because they believed that is why the war was so unpopular. So they changed everything about how they reported on war, the drafting of war, and all of these things. Now, let me get to the point. Basically, after Vietnam, a lot of people's material circumstances started to deteriorate through Reaganomics and other things. Now, I, as a sociological bitch, I have my own ideas about how this all relates to the war and people who are kind of asked or forced to enlist into the army. I have my little conspiracies about that. But the material circumstances for the average American was going downhill. Reaganomics was in full swing. Drugs and the crack epidemic were taking over, and things were just not looking good. The wealth gap was only getting bigger, and it was a lot of really dire circumstances for a lot of people. But when it came to enlisting in the war, this provided an opportunity ripe with exploitation because there was a population of poor people, poverty-stricken people, or people who had very little options in terms of trying to gain upward mobility to have a way to do so through enlisting in the Army. Now, if you don't know, as an Army person, you get a lot of benefits. Your family gets benefits, health care, free college, all sorts of things like that. To me personally, I think those benefits should be given to people not as prizes, but as basic human rights. But, this is America. But a lot of people use the Army route in order to lift their family out of, generational poverty or situations that are hard to be changed otherwise. And a lot of recruiters lie to these particular communities of people and tell them anything under the sun to get them to enlist in the Army, so that they have a big, robust population of people who are constantly being pumped through the military industrial complex, in order to help themselves raise up in socioeconomic status. And so because of this, a lot of people who are middle class or what have you, or don't live near a military base or don't live near a military town or don't have legacy military men in their family, you grow to see that talking about war, knowing people who are in wars, knowing veterans are very isolated incidents. So when I only knew my grandfather, and he was one of those people who used the Army as a means to an end. He wasn't particularly passionate about being an Army man, but he used it to get to where he wanted to go. And that's kind of the state of how the Army is able to draft people and get people to enlist in this country. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with access. It has to do with lack of options. And I, in my conspiratorial mind, believe that that's on purpose so that they no longer have to do public drafts that are widely unpopular, like in Vietnam. So there's not a lot of anti-war strongholds in this country anymore, but because they're fixated on a population of people that society is socialized not to care about very much, that people just lose interest and don't really pay attention to the wars we're a part of, the people who are forced to fight in those wars, the lies they're told to enlist, and all the drama around that. I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but, it makes sense. What I'm saying is, I was 5 when 9/11 happened, and after that point, we were basically in war ever since. And the reason why these wars, these 20-year wars, are able to go on for such a long time with little public discussion about it is partly because the population of people who are used to fight those wars were not socialized to care about, and they don't talk about it as explicitly as they used to talk about Vietnam. So they talk in very vague terms and things, insurgents, da-da-da-da-da. There was a drone strike here, blah, 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 blah. But they're not really as truthful and transparent as they used to be when it comes to war. Now, I say all that to say there's very vulnerable populations of people that enlist into the Army as a means to an end, as a strategic move to get to a point where they can retire and have benefits, start a family, get a house, and all of those things, which is a particularly vulnerable population of people. On top of that, you have to add the intersection of gender, and then on top of that, you have to add the intersection of race. And the Army hosts some of the most oppressed people in this country under its guise and under its control. So the story about Vanessa Guillen really, really struck a nerve with me and my feelings about the Army, because she was a Latinx woman who was found missing from her post, and the military kind of helped to cover things up in terms of telling her family. And we'll get into this story in a few moments. But some of the most vulnerable populations of people are in the Army, and she was one of those vulnerable populations, and she was not protected by the Army in the slightest. The Army can be a very dangerous boys' club, and it can be an incredibly unsafe place for women, particularly women of color. And her case really brought all these feelings up for me about how I feel about the Army, the military industrial complex as a whole, the people who are forced to go into it by circumstance, and how even in death, even in situations like what happened to Vanessa, aren't protected by the military industrial complex when it comes to actually doing something about figuring out what happened to them. So, without further ado, we're going to get into the story about Vanessa Guillén. She was a beautiful girl. She was very young, which really struck a nerve with me. Very young, beautiful girl who was taken way too soon. And so, without further ado, let's talk about it. So, in April of 2020, and mind you, let's go back in time, rewind. This is when shit started hitting the fan when it came to the pandemic. This is when I stopped going into my job. This is when I filed for unemployment. This was a time when things were starting to get serious. The freeways were clear in LA. The smog was gone in LA. Nobody was out. You still had to line up to get your groceries. It was the start of a very stressful time. And for Vanessa's family, that stress was even more so because they hadn't heard from her in a while. And things and thoughts about what happened to her started to get very dark. So this is where we begin the story, and this is where little reports of a missing woman start to enter our social consciousness on social media and things like that. So by April of 2020, Vanessa is missing. She's not in contact with her family at all, and things are starting to just beginning to heat up. So a week after we hear in April of Vanessa, kind of this story starting to develop, a BOLO report was put on Vanessa and her well-being to try and find out where she was, what was going on. And this is when her family started to connect the dots about the weird things about the fact that they hadn't heard from Vanessa. One, they were usually in constant contact with her. She would talk to her family a lot. Two, all of her belongings without her, meaning her wallet, her keys, her phone, were all found in the armory on the Fort Hood base. And three, nobody on the base had seen her since that day in April. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her. No one knew it was good. And so her family started to kind of be like, okay, something's really wrong here, and we really need to start putting the pressure on this situation. So Vanessa's sister, who was by far the most vocal in her family, started to talk about it on social media, asked people to share things, and started to talk more publicly about what was brewing in terms of this Vanessa's missing, the fact that Vanessa was missing. Now, the Army at this point in April decided to put out a $15,000 reward to anybody who knew anything about Vanessa's whereabouts and, could give them a tip, an anonymous tip as to where she was. And I want to put a pin here because for the Army to do this, it had taken a lot from her family, a lot of action and pushing and talking and discussion on social media about the whereabouts of Vanessa for them to even start to back them with the money and the reward money. So, it again, the intersections of race and womanhood start to rear its head early with the amount of pressure and time her family had to put out grassroots in order to try and find her and get this story developing so that some answers, some conclusions, some backing from the Army could be determined. So even with the reward being posted, the $15,000 being posted by the Army for any information about her whereabouts, there was crickets, there was nothing. Hours went by, days went by, weeks went by, and before they knew it, 39 days had gone by since they'd heard or seen anything regarding Vanessa. And her family was fed up by this, so they decided to organize a search party that had over 60 people there to search and go to a local park and try and search for clues around the Fort Hood area and get anything they could about where Vanessa might be. which is heartbreaking because after 30, anyone who's in true crime knows, like, there's a whole show called The First 48, but like 39 whole days not hearing a thing, even when money's involved, like, you have to assume for the best that she has run away and, you know, doesn't plan on coming back but is safe. At the worst, she's passed away in some kind of dark event. So they're getting nervous, but they're keeping a positive demeanor. All of her family gets interviewed at this 39-day point where they're searching the park. They all are trying to be positive, asking for Vanessa to come home, or whoever has Vanessa to just bring her back. And they're still keeping their hope alive. But by day 50 of not hearing anything about Vanessa's whereabouts, this is when social media started running with this story. And a lot of pressure was starting to be put on local news sources, national news sources, and the Fort Hood Army base itself to start giving the public answers about where Vanessa is and giving solutions as to what they're doing in order to find Vanessa or what happened to her. So protests started to happen, demonstrations started to happen, and the public was just so floored and confused as to how on an army base someone could ever go missing. On an army base, it's extremely secure. There are check-ins multiple times a day. People know who goes in, who goes out. There's logs about these things because it's a effing army base. So there's cameras everywhere. It's heavily secure. So everyone's just like wondering and feeling, and this is how I felt when I heard about the case, like, what happened to her, but what is going on beyond these walls, and how come nobody has seen anything, is reviewing any of the tapes of the many cameras on the base, is doing anything to try and figure out any kind of little snippet of a clue of where she is, where she could be. It was really confusing. So by June 2020, no new information about Vanessa, no new tips or anything regarding her whereabouts or what could have happened to her. So people are starting to get frustrated. People are donating to the reward fund. So instead of $15,000, it's $55,000 for anyone who has any tips that lead to information about where Vanessa was or could be, if she's alive or dead, and stuff like that. This was all through donations, and still they weren't hearing anything. But what a lot of people didn't realize was that about 2 days later, on June 18th, 2020, a breakthrough was about to come, or so they thought. So on June 18th, 2020, it was publicly stated to the media that Vanessa's body had actually been found. And it was found on the shooting range in the Fort Hood Army base. So unfortunately, this brought up way more questions than answers. The Army was supposed to be doing an internal investigation about where Vanessa was. How come she's just being found over 50 days after we put in the report, put in the request to find her, what started this whole national news situation? Who's responsible for this? What's going on behind the doors in Fort Hood? Because I thought they're supposed to be conducting some sort of investigation, and they're just now finding her body on a heavily populated area. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. It was just very, 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 very strange. And so that didn't actually stop any protests or quell people or calm people down in the fact that they claimed to have found her body. It ignited them, because now people were like, what's going on Fort Hood? What's going on this army base? What are they doing? Are they covering up a murder? This is really fucking weird. What's going on? For a while, Fort Hood had been known as a very dangerous and rough and tumble army base. Of all the army bases, it had kind of a negative reputation. It was known that people died on the base. People were abused on the base. There was just a rough culture there. there. There was like a lot of neglectful cover-up stuff from the upper management of the entire base. So as more information of this alleged discovering of Vanessa's body started to come out, more people were looking at Fort Hood like, what kind of ship are you running here? What the fuck is going on here? What is actually happening to the people that come in here? Are you actually protecting them? Or is there some deeper, darker criminal link going on? I'm just going to quickly read a quote about the culture of Fort Hood from a 2021 Vanity Fair article about the culture of Fort Hood. So give me 1 second. The numbers are distressing. Last year, at least 39 Fort Hood soldiers died or went missing, 13 killed themselves, 5 were murdered, 11 of the deaths remain unresolved, some legally, others for the victims' families. So all of this information is starting to come out at the same time about what the fuck is happening behind the gates of Fort Hood. It seems very sketchy. It seems very dangerous. Where's Vanessa? What is going on? So again, this is igniting more and more feelings of hatred towards, Fort Hood and the culture of Fort Hood. Lots of other stories of missing people started to come out at this time. I don't know if you remember online that there was just a ton of stories of missing people, weird circumstances that were happening to the people who lived and worked on Fort Hood. So like I said, on June 18th, 2020, there was a claim that Vanessa's body was found on the shooting range at Fort Hood, and it brought up more questions and answers about the culture of Fort Hood. But that was later found out to be an unfounded, complete fabrication of what happened. Vanessa's body still hadn't been found. Whatever body they found, if there was even a body on the shooting range, it was not her body. But new information was revealed from Vanessa's mother that started to make the case a little bit more interesting. Vanessa's mother revealed that Vanessa had called her and told her that she was being sexually harassed by another person on the base. She was very scared. She was very nervous. And her mom was saying that, she had told her about her being sexually harassed on the base by a particular person, and how it was, affecting her mental health and how she was scared. This is a big deal because this starts to kind of shape a picture now of a potential suspect, a potential person of interest, right? So everyone's kind of like, okay, why is this information just being spilled now? But also this is starting to add some shape to this story, and hopefully this information will lead us somewhere to find out what happened to Vanessa, where she is, and all of that. So what added validity to what her mother said was the fact that this information of Vanessa being sexually harassed was also corroborated by other Army people on the base. They were also agreeing. They knew that this sexual harassment was happening to Vanessa in particular. They had seen it with their own eyes. And so even though she had not made a formal complaint to her superiors, all of it was corroborated by many other people on the base that she was being targeted by a specific person and being sexually harassed. So, for all the people who like to victim blame, why didn't she put it in writing? Why didn't she report it? The Army is a boys' club, okay? And it can be a very, very scary and isolating place for a woman. There have been many cases of women reporting their sexual assault or harassment and then retaliation being targeted towards them, or a target being put on their back because they told of said harassment. So a lot of women keep it to themselves, or they decide not to speak on it or report it or put it in writing because there's this fear of retaliation and this fear of isolation and this fear of the abuse continuing or an escalation of the abuse. And a lot of women experience this in the culture of the Army, and it's really unfortunate and it's really sad. So before you want to victim blame, understand that context for which Vanessa was having this harassment happen to her, and, considering the reputation of Fort Hood, I'm sure she was just nervous in general about what this would do to her personal army career if she decided to say something. Again, this new bombshell of information brought in a flood of questions. Where is Vanessa? Is she still on the base? Is she somewhere else? What has happened to this woman? How is it on a base that's so secure with checkpoints every day and cameras everywhere? There's still not a whisper of what even happened to this girl other than her belongings were left in the armory the last day she was seen alive. So things start to get even more suspicious about how Fort Hood handles situations like this, what happened in particular with Vanessa's case, because it started to come out that the timeline that the family was giving and the timeline that Fort Hood was giving was not matching up at all, and there were a lot of holes in what Fort Hood was saying. One being that for some reason, even though on a very secure army base, there's no information on who Vanessa was working under that day, where she was working, and who she was working with the last day she was seen alive, which was really weird. There was holes in timing of when Fort Hood notified Vanessa's family that she was missing and they couldn't find her. And the third thing that I think is really, really disturbing and points to a cover-up, in my opinion, is the fact that the last day Vanessa was seen alive, she was seen alive at noon, but no one had seen her after noon that day, right? But the army base had checked her in as present on the base that night. So a lot of things were starting to come out where it was like, why would you check her in if you hadn't seen her since noon? And then there are holes in the story about what you told the family and when. And then there happened to be no records of who she was working for that particular day and who was with her that particular day. Even though all of these things should be recorded intensely, especially on an army base. So, people again start to be like, what is going on at Fort Hood? Where is Vanessa? This is getting sketchier and sketchier by the day. So the hashtag I am Vanessa Guillén started trending on Twitter and all around social media, where different military women were telling their stories of trauma, being a part of the military and having to deal with very particular instances of harassment, abuse, sexual abuse, and just crazy situations in general, not being believed, cover-ups, all sorts of things. So again, the traction is continuing. People are trying to figure out where this girl is, what's happening, and people are starting to use her name as a rallying cry for women in the army and the lack of protections put in place to protect them in that space. So the social media was social mediaing. In fact, in 2018, over 25% of women in active duty said that they had been harassed sexually or assaulted sexually in some capacity. So put that into perspective. 1/4 of active duty women officers said that they had either been harassed sexually or abused sexually in one or two occasions while they were in active duty. So this is a rampant problem. And that's what makes it so scary, because she was so young. And it's just so sad because she was only able to talk to her mom about it. And, clearly there's a boys culture there, boys club culture, but it's an extremely, extremely dangerous place for a woman, particularly a woman of color. So then June 30th, 2020 rolls up. And this is the actual day that they do find, and it's confirmed that they do find Vanessa's body. Vanessa's body is not on the Fort Hood base. It's in a remote location, and her human remains were spotted by a civilian who was working on a fence in that area and spotted the human remains there. The weird part about it is this area had been searched multiple times before. With this exact spot had been searched multiple times before for her remains, and nobody had found it. It had been searched as early as a week before, as close to a week before that her actual body was found in that same spot. So that kind of alludes to the fact that she probably was moved or placed there or discarded there, or something else had happened, but her body was found there 7 days later. And this is where things start to get really fishy. The same day her body was found, the person of interest that the Army had been pursuing, who was an officer on the base, had left his post and was walking around the city limits. As the officers were closing in on him, he shoots himself in the head and dies at the scene. This all happened in one day. And we'll get more into who he was in the story, but that's what was going on. Okay, so let me read you the quick recap of what has happened so far before we get into the story about who shot himself and what is speculated to have happened to Vanessa. So just to recap, Vanessa was reported missing on April 20th, 2020. On June 23rd, 2020, searchers for Vanessa came to a spot 30 miles away from the Fort Hood base and found a storage container lid that was partially burned, but there was no human remains there. Exactly 1 week later, contractors that were hired to build a fence in this remote area 30 miles away from the Fort Hood base noticed a foul smell and looked around only to discover the human remains that were later to be confirmed as Vanessa's body. Okay? That same day, an officer of interest left his post and was seen walking in the city limits, and as soon as police were closing in on him, he shot himself in the head and died at the scene. Ciao. So the person that shot themselves in the head and died at the scene was confirmed to be an Army specialist named Aaron Robinson. And after his identity was confirmed and he was confirmed dead, the officers rushed to his home where they arrested his girlfriend, Cicely Aguilar, and took her in for questioning. And I just want to put a disclaimer here. Because Vanessa is no longer alive and Aaron unalived himself, Cicely Aguilar's testimony and confession as to what happened is the only story or explanation as to what happened to Vanessa that we have and that we are going off of in order to fill in the blanks of the story. Okay? So just so you know this. And things have been corroborated by locations of phone signals and things like that. So they do believe this to be mostly true for the most part. The things that are sketchy are the motivations as to why Vanessa was targeted and murdered. But let's get into Cicely's story. So first things first, Cicely and Aaron had been suspects and people of interest in this case of Vanessa's disappearance since April. We're at the end of June here. Since April, the Army had been doing their own investigation on what happened, and according to the Army investigation, those two were people of interest in this case from the time of April. Aaron had been called in for questioning because it was seen that he had texted Vanessa's phone the day she had disappeared. And so he was brought into questioning, and mind you, this was all back in April. And the family had no idea there were even suspects. The family had no idea there were even persons of interest. Obviously, nobody knew where Vanessa was, but nothing was being communicated to Vanessa's family about who, what, or if there were any kind of potential suspects on who could have done this to their child at all. So they were in the dark since April. So like I said, when Aaron Robinson is brought in for questioning, he admits to texting Vanessa's phone. He admits to leaving the base that day and coming back to the base. And this was all said in April. This was all talked about in April. The family's in the complete dark. The public's in the complete dark about everything. Apparently, Cicely Aguilar was the estranged wife of another person on the base, but she was still dating Robinson, which is a big Army no-no, and we'll get to that later. And according to the Army investigation, in May, so again, back in May, 2 people from the Army base had come forward and answered questions and reported that they had seen Aaron Robinson on that day carrying a big-ass storage container out of the base and putting it into his car. On the day Vanessa went missing, he took it from the armory and had put it into his car. Okay? Mind you, the armory is the exact same room where all of Vanessa's belongings had just been there when she was, when people started to notice that she was missing. Her keys, her phone, important things were left in the armory. And this man was seen leaving the armory by two witnesses who came forward in May, talking about how he was seen leaving the armory, pulling a huge storage container with wheels and pulling that storage container into his fucking car. Ciao. So, they had seen him dragging this storage container and struggling with it and struggling with lifting it into his car. He left the base. And according to these two witness stories about him with the storage container, the investigators were able to subpoena his call log and his phone situation from the phone company, which is where things start to make sense. And what his phone records said basically was throughout the entire day, he had been in contact with Cecily Aguilar, all day long, and things are starting to close in. So based on that, they were able to bring in Cecily Aguilar for questioning for the first time. Now, they brought her in multiple times, okay? So she comes in the first time, and she says, "Oh, I called Aaron because I lost my phone." And they were like, "Girl, what kind of story is that? That doesn't make a lick of sense. You called him to let him know you lost your phone, but you were in contact all day, according to the records, to a phone that belongs to you." So that doesn't make any sense. Now, the second time she's brought in, and the second story she decides to tell is, "Oh, Aaron Robinson and I had planned a romantic evening together to look at the stars in a remote spot, and made up this whole elaborate romantic picnic under the stars date." And investigators were like, "Okay, you didn't tell us anything about this the first time. Your first story sounded fishy. This story sounds fishy, but it also sounds like you're trying to account for the fact that you were in a remote location where her body was found." So again, suspicious. So the officers are basically continuing to dig in because her stories aren't making sense. She's making up elaborate lies. And through the phone records, they see that both Aguilar and Robinson's phones were pinned at the exact location where Vanessa's body was found, 30 miles outside of Fort Hood, in that exact location where her body was found. And so they brought that information to her, and this is the third time she's brought in for questioning, and then she actually folds and discusses what exactly had happened between Aaron and Vanessa. And to be frank, their phones had pinged and said they were at that location for 2 whole hours. So things were starting to close in on her, and she finally decided to admit the fact that she and Robinson, what happened between Robinson and Vanessa, and what she knew about the story. So according to her, this is what Robinson had told her about what happened to Vanessa. Robinson had told her that he had seen Vanessa in the armory and had proceeded to beat her to death with a hammer in the armory on the base, had put her body into a big storage container and moved the storage container to an undisclosed location on the base so no one would fuck with it. After that, he then moved that storage container to his car and off the base. And that's when those 2 eyewitnesses saw him struggling with it and putting it in his car. He had dropped off the storage container at that location 30 miles away from the base, and then went to go pick up Cecily. He picks up Cecily from her gas station job, takes her to the remote location where he had already dropped off the container. He opens it up, and it's Vanessa's body in there, and she helps him without question dismember her body, take off her limbs and her head, bury them all into shallow graves, and then cover those graves with some sort of cement mixture as to throw off the dogs with the scent and make sure that her body didn't come up out of the soil. So it's really, really effing dark. And she was helping him hide evidence and hide her body. They had put her dismembered body into 3 separate holes that they had dug. And, that was that. That was the end of Vanessa. That was the end of the story. And that is what Cicely had admitted to. Apparently, according to her, the reason why Robinson had done this to her was because she was threatening to tell everybody that they were dating, and that was a huge no-no because she was still married to another military person on the base, and they would both get reprimanded. So that's the working theory that Cicely says. I don't know if Robinson told her that, if she actually believed that, if it's a lie that Robinson said, or it's just not true altogether. And it really was over the fact that Vanessa was being sexually harassed by this particular person on this base, and nothing had been done about it. And then he decided to target her. But again, because Robinson killed himself and Vanessa was murdered, this is a 3-person story, and 2 of the people are gone. So we are forced to be given and spoon-fed with the story that Cicely decided to say. And unfortunately, her story could be corroborated by the cell phone locations, the length of time she was there, and all of that type of thing. Oh, and I forgot to say that they attempted to burn her body, but that didn't work. So they put her in the holes and put the cement over it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the incredibly sad, incredibly tragic, incredibly unfortunate case of Vanessa Guillén. She was a beautiful young woman. She was not supported or protected in the slightest in arguably one of the safest places that you should be as a person, an army base. What pisses me off about this story is the intense work the family had to do to get this story into mainstream media. It should have already been talked about. It should have already been discussed because it was highly unusual and strange. Secondly, the fact that Fort Hood has such a crazy reputation for being a very negative place, that the higher-ups are neglectful, that there are murders and assaults that happen that go unchecked all the time. And people have reported this. The fact that Vanessa had told her mother that she was repeatedly being sexually harassed by a particular person on the base and nothing had been done about it. And several people had seen it happen and nothing had been done about it. I think it's super weird that the Fort Hood base did not share the results of their investigation until they couldn't hide that they'd been investigating these 2 suspects since Vanessa's case came into the mainstream consciousness in April. And the only reason why it came out that they had been fucking investigating Cicely Aguilar and Aaron Robinson was because he ended up killing himself when the same day her body was found. I think it's sick that Cicely helped dismember Vanessa's body. I think it's even more tragic that she just, this whole story shows that she was not protected at any place in any way. She was not kept safe at all, and her parents, and she was a young woman, and she was doing something for herself and for her family. She was enlisting in the army for a reason. She was passionate about her role in fighting in being an active army person on behalf of this country. And what does she get? She gets fucking murdered by somebody, and he dies as well. So there's no justice to be served except for Cicely, who didn't kill herself and obviously was arrested for the whole situation, and her involvement in that. I'm disgusted by the negligence of the Fort Hood base, because during the time that Vanessa's story was starting to get really popping on social media, so many deaths and suicides and things were reported on Fort Hood, and I find it weird that we don't talk about what goes on at Fort Hood very often or very publicly, because it's weird and it seems like a just generally very negative, hateful, abusive place. I thought Vanessa's story needed to be underscored because obviously this is the month in which her body was found. So I thought it was best to talk about it in this month. I'm happy that they were able to get to the bottom of it because it seemed like for a long time there was lots of dodginess, holes in the story. It smelled of a cover up to me. But I'm so happy that they got some conclusion. I don't know if it's the exact right conclusion, but some conclusion nonetheless. It also, let me just say this in conclusion, it really pisses me off that Cecily chose to say that the reason why they did this to this young girl was because she was going to expose them because she was married and Aaron Robinson wasn't, which doesn't really make sense to me. To me, I think that he was the one sexually harassing her and she was threatening him to report him, and he didn't want that to happen. So he killed her and either told Cecily a lie or told her the truth, but she agreed to help him nonetheless and wasn't fazed by it. I can't imagine seeing the news reports and social media start to pop off about the whereabouts of this woman, where you know exactly where the fuck she is, what the fuck happened to her, and you're just sitting there keeping your mouth shut. It's disgusting behavior. Those people are trash human beings, and I hope that Vanessa is resting in peace because she did not deserve the treatment that she got from any of this army shit, period. R.I.P. to you. And, you know, I'm sending love and care and positive energy to your family because this grieving process probably was and is so difficult for them. But, yeah, so again, if you like this topic, if you like the story, please like and subscribe and comment down below. It helps the video go work out well. Watch the whole thing. Help a girl get monetized. If you're new here, hit that notification bell so you know exactly when I post. Like I said at the top, I do true crime centering BIPOC individuals. I also do documentary reactions and TV show or YouTube show reactions, so check those out because I commented on them through a sociological lens. So if that's interesting to you, stick around. Welcome to the Madison channel. Please tell your friends and share about this channel. If you're returning, thank you for returning. Love you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And without further ado, I guess all I have to say is Black Lives Matter and free Palestine until it's backwards.